Given up at birth by two graduate students who could not become parents, Steve Jobs, American businessman, designer, and inventor, would go on to revolutionize the computer industry and become one of the most respected and innovative men in the field due to the influence of his adoptive father.
Steve Jobs is probably going to be considered, after some of the greatest inventors of America.
He was a living legend, a living innovator.
Jobs is best known as the co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Apple Incorporated.
He's an icon for innovation and for corporate success.
In addition, he is responsible for creating the animated movie company Pixar.
Passion equals perfection. At the end of the day, he was a perfectionist because he was so passionate about creating this thing.
And to think, it all started in a garage. Born in San Francisco on February 24, 1955, Steve Jobs' parents were two University of Wisconsin graduate students that had to give their child up for adoption. Jobs would not be able to find out anything about his birth parents until he was 27 years old. Then, he would find out that his mother was Joanne Scheibel and his Syrian father was Abdul Fattah John Jandali. Since it was the 50s, fathers had much more impact upon their children, especially their daughters. Joanne's father did not want her marrying Jandali and forbade the marriage. However, he died shortly thereafter, and the two of them married in 1955, shortly after they put Steve up for adoption. They moved to Syria after Jandali graduated. Because of the turmoil in his country, Jandali was unable to obtain a career as a diplomat and instead managed an oil refinery. Joanne was unhappy in Syria and ended up moving home to Green Bay, where she would give birth to their second child in 1957, a daughter. She and Jandali would divorce in 1962. His sister Mona uses the last name of her stepfather, Simpson, as does Joanne. After being placed for adoption, he would be adopted by Paul Reinhold Jobs, 1922 to 1993, and Clara Jobs, 1924 to 1986. They named their new son Stephen Paul Jobs. The family moved from San Francisco when Jobs was 5 years old to live in Mountain View, California. They would also adopt a daughter later who would be named Patty. Clara was an accountant who taught Paul how to read before he even went to school. She worked for a company called Varian Associates, one of the first firms in what would be known as Silicon Valley. Paul was a Coast Guard vet, and he worked as a machinist for a company that made lasers. While he was little, Steve's father would take his son to the family garage, and they would tinker with electronics. Paul showed his son how to take apart and reconstruct the electronics they worked on. Their hobby would give Steve the ability and the confidence that would help him to eventually revolutionize the field of computers. Jobs always replied emphatically that Clara and Paul were his parents whenever asked. In fact, in an authorized biography, he stated that they were my parents 1,000%. Jobs had difficulty in school. He was considered to be a prankster and was actually bribed by his fourth-grade teacher so that he would study. However, when the school tested him, they found out that he was very intelligent, and they wanted to skip him ahead to high school. His parents did not agree with this plan and refused to do so. Jobs then attended Cupertino Junior High and Homestead High School in Cupertino, California. During this time, he spent a lot of his free time at Hewlett-Packard, attending after-school lectures at Palo Alto, California.
He got his start in electronics at a very young age. He called up the founder of Hewlett-Packard, literally got the phone book, opened it up, and went to his number, called him on the phone, and asked him very precise technical questions, I believe about some sort of switchboard or some kind of electronic component that a 12-year-old is not supposed to know about. Essentially, that single phone call landed him a job as an intern.
Hewlett-Packard would be where he would meet another employee who he would become friends with and later begin to change the way computers were used. Steve Wozniak was introduced to Steve Jobs in 1971.
At that time, Steve was about 16, and Steve Wozniak was about 21 years old. They both shared many interests, and one of which was the technology.
Wozniak was a computer engineer, and he and Jobs found that they developed a mutual respect for each other during the time they worked together.
Well, the history of Apple is a history of certain eras, and it got started at the beginning of the small computer revolution. Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak didn't invent small computers, but working out of the Homebrew Computer Club up in the Silicon Valley area, they were the first ones to put together a total package.
After graduating in 1972, Jobs enrolled at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Jobs had a difficult time deciding upon a major. After 6 months, he dropped out and then spent the next year and a half auditing creative classes. One course in particular, calligraphy, helped him to create his love of typography. He said later, if he had never taken that course, that the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. Atari became Jobs' next project. He began working in Los Gatos, California in 1974 as a video game designer. During this time, he was sleeping on a friend's floor, returning pop bottles for cash, and getting free meals at the Hare Krishna temple.
He began to go to Hare Krishna temple for food, for vegetarian meals. And that's when his real devotion and this idea of going to India and going on a journey of achieving enlightenment, that's when it really started.
Shortly after starting his job, he left to go to India to find spiritual enlightenment by visiting Neem Karoli Baba with a friend, Daniel Kotke. They arrived in India only to discover that Neem Karoli Baba had died in September 1973. Jobs stayed in India for 7 months, returning to the United States ahead of his friend. He came back with a shaved head and wearing traditional Indian clothing. Jobs stated that during this time, he experimented with psychedelic drugs. He even stated that his LSD experiences were one of the 2 or 3 most important things he had done in his life. Jobs also converted to Zen Buddhism, which he would continue to practice for the rest of his life. He spent a lot of time at the Tassayara Zen Mountain Center, the oldest Soto Zen monastery in the United States, in long meditation retreats. At one point, Jobs even thought about taking up a monastic residence.
To be Steve Jobs and to admit to doing LSD, to admit to doing like this 8-month India spiritual journey, and then still being this person of immaculate success, just shows a lot about how important it is to really kind of expand your mind to a point where it's not just about books and numbers. You know, it's really about yourself, and I think that if there's anything you can learn from Steve Jobs is that.
He was once quoted as saying that people around him who did not share his countercultural roots could not fully relate to his thinking. Jobs would return to his job at Atari, where he would be assigned a project to create a circuit board for a game called Breakout. Atari co-founder Nolan Bushnell offered $100 for every chip eliminated from the machine. At this point, Jobs had little interest or ability of circuit boards and was unable to complete the project. So he contacted Wozniak and told him that he would split the fee in half with him if he could reduce the number of chips.
He was an engineering whiz, and he was a brainchild essentially of knowing a lot of different things about electronics and engineering that, you know, Steve sort of did not necessarily aspire to know, but realized there was something there.
To everyone's amazement at Atari, Wozniak was able to reduce the number by 50 in a design so tight that it was unable to be reproduced on an assembly line.
The deal there was that that was very economical, and that's where Steve Jobs really began to appreciate the difference between an ordinary electronics designer and someone like Steve Wozniak, who was a genius at it.
That's kind of what brought, I think, Steve Jobs and Wozniak to this level that people were like, wow, these guys can actually make something that's never been created before.
Wozniak would later claim that Jobs had told him that Atari had only given them $700 instead of the offered $5,000.
Supposedly he was supposed to give him $2,500, but he actually only gave him, what, I think $350?
He only found out about the full amount 10 years later, stating that Jobs had told him he needed the money. According to Wozniak, if Jobs had just asked him for the money, he would have let him have it.
Steve Jobs had the charisma, had the kind of intensity, the drive, whereas Steve Wozniak was probably, more of the brains, the guy that was able to kind of create this software that Steve Jobs envisioned. That's kind of the way that I see their relationship coming along.
Jobs greatly admired the inventor of instant photography and founder of Polaroid, Edwin H. Land, and intentionally modeled his own career after Land's. Then, at the age of 21, Jobs and Wozniak started what would eventually become one of the largest computer companies ever, in the Jobs family garage with Ronald Wayne. Wozniak had invented the Apple I computer. So, in 1976, the company of Apple Computers was founded. They funded this new venture by Jobs selling his Volkswagen and Wozniak selling his scientific calculator. They also received funding from Mike Markula, who was a semi-retired Intel product marketing manager and engineer. The computer industry would be revolutionized by the company with the humble beginnings. Apple Incorporated is credited with making computers smaller, cheaper, and accessible to the common person. Their concept was to make a series of computers that they initially sold for $666.66 each. The Apple I, created by Wozniak, was the first in the series and earned them over $700,000.
Wozniak, in particular, was a genius about putting together circuits with minimal chips. And he was able to drive video output with almost directly from the outputs of this chip, making a very simple, a very economical machine.
Apple II came after what was then the Lisa, which was the first computer that Apple created. Apple II was essentially Steve's baby, literally.
Steve Wozniak was actually the creator of Apple II series, which did really well in the market.
The Apple II really broke Apple into the big time. It was a machine that was a package, and it had a floppy disk drive attached to it. Now, at that time, this was a big step upward. And the floppy disk drive that they designed, that Steve Wozniak designed, was remarkable in its economy. Wozniak looked at hard disks, floppy disks that were designed by IBM, floppy disks that came out of Shugart that were being used in the North Star, and he figured out how to get rid of all those controller chips and have a very, very simple circuit.
The Apple II was to be the premier Apple product.
If you're in financial analysis, or if you're an MBA student, or even if you're an accountant and you have to work with numbers, this tool gave you a competitive advantage over the other people in your profession. There wasn't anything else like it. It was a real innovation.
3 years after it had been released, sales increased by 700%, and the company earned $139 million. The company went public in 1980 and ended up with a market value of $1.2 billion the first day of trading. Jobs began working on John Sculley to lure him away from Pepsi to become the CEO of Apple.
He was the CEO of Pepsi-Cola at the time, and Steve simply stated to him plainly, do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to change the world? Sculley joined him, helped him run the company, and in order for Steve to focus on the product side of the business and be close to his engineers and the development of the various products that Apple was intending to put out, he needed someone with a strong operational background in order to run the business.
Steve Jobs looked at Sculley as someone who could really change the world and help him do that, which was a big kind of, big thing for the company to have this guy from Pepsi-Cola, who obviously was a very esteemed businessman in the world.
In spite of its earlier success, The next several products produced by Apple had design flaws that ended in recalls and customer dissatisfaction. Apple was suddenly being surpassed by IBM, and Apple had to learn to compete with this new company that dominated the business world.
Throughout Apple's business history, Jobs has had this sense of the product.
Now I'd like to show you Macintosh in person. All of the images you are about to see on the large screen will be generated by what's in that bag.
An employee of Apple by the name of Jeff Raskin invented the Macintosh. The Macintosh was released in 1984, and despite good sales and performance better than IBM's computers, it was not compatible with IBM.
The big battle of the 1980s was between the IBM PC and DOS, its operating system, and the Intel chip, and the whole architecture of plugins and software coming from lots of people, and Apple's desire to sell a Macintosh, which was essentially a closed system. And the Macintosh was way ahead of its time. It was a graphics user interface, it had a mouse, it had Windows, and this is the point in time if you were buying an IBM PC, the thing had a teletype screen. There was no graphics, there was no mouse, it was a keyboard and a screen. And so the Macintosh was way ahead of its time, and it was, in what's today's language, it was a closed system. There was no way to plug in other boards to drive other things. And the IBM PC, IBM didn't intend it this way, but the IBM PC's design was loose enough that it got cloned, and that there were many, many different boards, video boards, memory boards, music boards, who knows what could be put into it. And that open system won the day.
It was at this point that Scully began to believe that Jobs was only hurting the company. So after losing in a power struggle to the board of directors, Jobs was phased out and left Apple in 1985.
The way the politics works in business seems that majority rules, and Steve Jobs was out.
That same year, Jobs began a new company called Next Incorporated. Jobs gave a speech at Stanford University in 2005. During this speech, he said that being fired from Apple was the best thing that could have happened to him. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. I am pretty sure none of this would have happened if I hadn't been fired from Apple. It was awful tasting medicine, but I guess the patient needed it.
Next Computer was Steve's answer to computer stations for the education community.
He had this vision of a computer that he could sell essentially to academics. It was going to be an academic workstation.
The wisdom that he attained from his years at Apple helped him bring a different approach to Next.
He started this company with $7 million. Billionaire Ross Perot helped bail out the company a year later when he invested a lot of money into the failing company. In 1990, Next released workstations priced at almost $10,000.
Cutting a long story short, the thing was very expensive. If you wanted to buy one, it was $6,000 to $10,000. And it didn't sell in very large quantities. I think one of my colleagues here at UCLA had one, and we were all jealous for a while. But you really couldn't do anything with it that you couldn't do with existing products.
Although the workstation was good technologically, it was considered to be too costly by those in the education sector that it had been created for.
He really wanted to make sure that this company, Next, was developing products that came from the heart.
Jobs didn't give up and continued marketing. This time, he marketed to the financial, scientific, and academic community. He emphasized the new experimental technology, like the Mach kernel, the digital signal processor chip, and a built-in Ethernet port. In fact, the new technology enabled Tim Berners-Lee to invent the World Wide Web. Jobs released the second-generation Next Cube in 1990. He claimed it was going to be a replacement for the personal computer. Boasting an innovative NextMail multimedia email system, the Next Cube was able to share voice, image, graphics, and video in email for the first time. Jobs told reporters that interpersonal computing is going to revolutionize human communications and group work. However, Jobs' obsession to have a perfect product strained the hardware division. The company had to transition completely to software in 1993, after selling only 50,000 units. In 1994, Next had their first year of profits, showing $1.03 million. They then created Web Objects in 1996 as a framework for web application development. In 1986, Jobs purchased the graphics division from Lucasfilm that would later become Pixar Animation Studios. Because of his belief in Pixar, Jobs would sink $50 million of his own money into the company. As everyone knows, Pixar went on to produce incredibly popular animated films like Toy Story, Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, and the list goes on. Altogether, Pixar films have netted over $4 billion. He remained the largest shareholder of Pixar, with 50.1% until 2006. In 2006, Pixar and Disney merged, making Jobs Disney's largest shareholder, with 7% of the shares, and he became a member of Disney's board of directors.
Most businesses that are public companies are driven by financial results. When I sit down with most businesses, what they call their strategy is a forecast of their financial results over the next 3 to 5 years. And I make my money, I make my contribution by forcing them to look away from that to what are the real strategic issues facing their business. What are their product challenges? What are their market challenges? How do they solve the problems facing them? Steve Jobs ran his company in a very different way. He didn't look at financial results.
Oh gosh. You know, Apple, I haven't been there in a long time, but my perception is...
We won't blame you for what's happened in the last 10 years.
Yeah, no, I mean, my perception may not be complete, but from the way I see it, I mean, Apple was a company that was based on innovation. When I left Apple 10 years ago, we were 10 years ahead of anybody else. It took Microsoft 10 years to copy Windows. The problem was that Apple stood still. Even though it invested cumulatively billions in R&D, the output has not been there, and people have caught up with it, and its differentiation has eroded, in particular with respect to Microsoft.
Apple Inc. announced in 1996 that it would be purchasing the company Next for $429 million. When the deal was finalized later that year, it would bring Jobs back to the company he had helped found. After Gil Amelio, the current CEO of Apple, left in July of 1997.
At that point, the innovation that he accomplished during his time with Next would be integrated into Apple's future. A lot of the software programs that were developed at Next would soon become Apple's operating system.
He wanted to create products that would reach more than just businesses.
Jobs became the de facto CEO. It was made official in September. Purchasing Next enabled Apple to utilize its technology into Apple products. For example, the Web Objects program was used to develop and then run the Apple Store, MobileMe services, and the iTunes Store. Next Step was another that Apple utilized. It ended up evolving into Mac OS X. Once again, Steve Jobs is credited with the comeback of Apple in the 1990s. He had a self-imposed salary of $1 a year, a new management team, and altered stock options, and with these changes, was able to bring Apple back from the brink.
He tries to balance out his life in terms of like creating something that's going to be very, very efficient, and then creating something that's also going to look very good and be intuitive and aesthetically pleasing. And those two different parts of the brain is a balance.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we're making a lot of them, but we're going to find out since the iMac goes on sale this Saturday, tomorrow, across the U.S., and in about 2 weeks in Europe and Japan, we're going to find out what the real demand is, and it could exceed lots. So we don't know yet.
With new and innovative products like the iMac, and effective methods of garnering attention from the public, like appealing designs and better marketing, consumers once again began buying Apple products.
So Steve Jobs brought to management, this intense focus on the absolute quality and purity of the product. And when we look around at the products we do buy, we find that that's not present in most of them. They don't work in many ways. They fail in many ways. They're rushed to market in many ways. And so he brought that, and he showed that for certain kinds of products and for certain kinds of customers, this attention to detail and to tight integration and to having the thing actually work the way it's supposed to, there's a huge customer reaction, and there's a lot of money to be made.
Jobs continued to work on increasing Apple's profitability. To help meet this goal, he terminated several projects in March of 1998. For the next few months, other employees were afraid to ride in the elevator with Jobs, for fear that they would not have a job by the end of the ride. In reality, Jobs rarely summarily dismissed personnel, but it was enough that the rest of the employees were nervous.
No one expected Steve Jobs to act in this way. Steve Jobs didn't have a reputation as a strategy person or as a manager. And to take hold of this company and do what was necessary, to do what professional managers hadn't done for 2 or 3 years, to cut the clutter, to cut the company back to a core that could survive rather than spend more money on expansion at that moment, was very surprising coming from this guy in his background. And it's the moment in which he grew up.
In addition to those measures, Jobs changed the licensing program for Macintosh clones that made it too expensive for others to continue to produce.
A year later, I remember I was up there and I talked to him and I said, well, Steve, you've saved Apple. It's no longer about to go bankrupt, but you still only have a 4.5% market share. And the network externalities here are so strong that you're really not going to go and defeat the Wintel standard. So what's the long-term objective here? Where are you going with this? And he didn't disagree with my criticism or my analysis. He just leaned back in his chair and he gave this sort of Cheshire cat smile. And he said, I'm going to wait for the next big thing.
In an attempt to branch out and diversify, Apple would introduce and improve upon other digital appliances. The Web Objects program that Next had created would be used to help them branch into digital music.
Something like 30 to 60% of the internet traffic on college campuses was Napster. Music being downloaded and moved around by students. And people, the public, the market, became acquainted with the idea that music is data.
They introduced the iPod, a portable music player, iTunes music software, and the iTunes Store.
The music companies were all struggling with this. What do we do? What do we do? Our music is being stolen. Each one wanted to set up a private store on the internet to sell its music as catalogs, as albums. None of that was working. And Jobs came along and said, no, you've got to work through a unified store. You've got to work through me. So Jobs, charming, full of technological knowledge, understanding both the art side of the business because he'd been at Pixar, he'd been banging around Hollywood, understanding the technology side, manages to convince these music companies to distribute their songs unbundled, one song at a time, over his iTunes store, promising that his digital rights management, his control of the store, of the computer, of the iPod would diminish the amount of piracy.
This enabled them to enter the consumer electronics and music distribution arenas.
iTunes is one of the remarkable business stories of his whole career. And it's a remarkable business story in American business.
The introduction of the iPhone on June 27, 2007, branched the company into the cell phone business. The iPhone was a revolutionary design in that it was a multi-touch display cell phone, but with the features of an iPod and with its own browsing capability, changing the scene of mobile browsing. Jobs was attacked in 2005 for the company's poor recycling programs for e-waste in the United States. He lashed out at the environmentalist and the others attacking the company at Apple's annual meeting in Cupertino in April. Not long after, Apple announced that it would take back iPods for free at its retail stores. The response from the Take Back campaign for recycling was to fly a banner from a plane over Stanford University graduation, where Jobs was the commencement speaker. The banner simply stated, "Steve, don't be a mini player. Recycle all e-waste." 2006 saw the expansion of the recycling program, as Jobs announced that their recycling program had been expanded to all United States customers buying a new Mac. The program would include shipping and environmentally friendly disposal of all their old systems. Steve Jobs' reinvention of Apple has been responsible for some amazing products like the MacBook Air, iPod, and the iPhone. These inventions are credited with the evolution of modern technology. It is to the point where Apple releases a product and competitors spend their time trying to come up with comparable technology. The quarterly reports from 2007 were the most impressive in the company's history. Stock for the company sold at an amazing $199.99 a share. Their profit was an amazing $1.58 billion, leaving an $18 billion surplus and zero debt. iTunes became the second biggest music retailer in America, second only to Walmart in 2008. iTunes and iPod sales count for half of Apple's revenue alone, with 200 million iPods sold and 6 billion songs downloaded. This is why Apple has been rated #1 in America's most admired companies and #1 among Fortune 500 companies for returns to shareholders.
To understand Steve Jobs and his whole career and the progression of Apple as a company, you have to understand that Steve Jobs was the customer.
When you grow up, you tend to get told that the world is the way it is, and your life is just to live your life inside the world, try not to bash into the walls too much, try to have a nice family life, have fun, save a little money. That's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you.
I guess he uses the quote, he gives 1,000% to his parents, Paul and Clara, for raising him, which is very nice. It seems to mean that, you know, he actually really cared for his parents and his parents who were raising him.
In spite of his close relationship with his adoptive family, Jobs was curious about his birth family. He found his birth mother, Joanne Simpson, who told him that he had a biological sister, Mona. They would meet for the first time in 1985 and would become close friends. They kept their relationship secret until a party in 1986, where Mona had a party for her first book and introduced him as her older brother. Jandali had lost touch with his daughter in 1962 after he and Joanne divorced. Mona decided to find their father and found him managing a coffee shop. Not knowing who his son had become, Jandali told Mona that he had managed a popular restaurant where even Steve Jobs used to eat. Later, in a taped interview with his biographer Walter Isaacson, Jobs stated that he had looked for his father at the same time as he had been looking for his mother.
When I was looking for my biological mother, obviously, was looking for my biological father at the same time. And I learned a little bit about him, and I didn't like what I learned. And I asked her to not tell him that we had ever met and not tell him anything about me.
Jobs says of his biological parents, "They were my sperm and egg bank. That's not harsh, it's just the way it is. A sperm bank thing, nothing more." Jandali had apparently tried to contact Jobs and stated in an interview with The Sun in 2011 that he had been unsuccessful. After learning about Jobs' pancreatic cancer, Jandali did mail his medical history to him. Chris Ann Brennan, Jobs' longtime girlfriend, told him that she had had his daughter, Lisa Brennan Jobs, born in 1978 when Jobs was 23. Brennan was a painter and ended up raising their child on welfare for 2 years because Jobs denied he was the father. He stated in court that he could not be the father as he was sterile. However, later, he did acknowledge Lisa as his daughter. There was no relationship with her until she was 7 years old. In addition, she did come to live with him as a teenager. In the early 1990s, Jobs met Laurene Powell at Stanford Business School, where Powell was an MBA student. In 1991, Jobs married Laurene Powell on March 18th in a ceremony at the Awane Hotel in Yosemite National Park. Kobun Chino Otagawa, a Zen Buddhist monk, presided over their ceremony. Their first son, Reed, was born September 1991, followed by two daughters, Erin in August of 1995 and Eve in 1998. They lived in Palo Alto, California. In addition to being a huge fan of the Beatles, Jobs referred to them many times during speeches and interviews. He was asked in an interview on 60 Minutes about his business practices. Jobs stated that he modeled his business after the Beatles. He stated, "They were four guys that kept each other's negative tendencies in check. They balanced each other. And the total was greater than the sum of the parts. Great things in business are never done by one person. They are done by a team of people." Jobs was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in October 2003. He announced in the middle of 2004 to Apple employees that he had a tumor. Although the prognosis for pancreatic cancer is usually not good, Jobs stated that he had a rare, less aggressive type known as islet cell neuroendocrine tumor. This type is usually easily treated by surgery. However, Jobs refused surgery, stating that it was too invasive and looked to Eastern medicine to find a cure.
This was someone who, when he was younger, was experimenting with all sorts of diets. He was involved with macrobiotic diets before people even knew, what a macrobiotic diet was.
Jobs changed his diet, becoming vegan, tried acupuncture, herbal remedies, and other alternatives. For 9 months, he fought his doctor's advice and refused standard medical treatment. He was apparently also being influenced by a doctor that encouraged juice fasts, bowel cleansing, and other unproven methods. This decision, according to his biographer Walter Isaacson, was one he later regretted as his health declined. According to Harvard researcher Dr. Ramzi Amir, his choice of accepting alternative methods for treatment led to an unnecessarily early death that could have been avoided. Jobs broke down 9 months later, and in July 2004 underwent surgery that successfully removed the tumor. He apparently did not receive chemotherapy or radiation therapy. During his absence, Tim Cook, who was the head of worldwide sales and operations at Apple, ran the company. At the annual Worldwide Developers Conference in August 2006, Jobs' thin, gaunt appearance, combined with the delegation of significant parts of his speech to others, fueled more speculation and rumors about his health. This conflicted with an Ars Technica report that had attendees of the conference stating Jobs looked fine. Apple even had a spokesperson comment upon his health and state that his health was robust. The same concerns were voiced 2 years later, following his 2008 keynote address. At this time, Apple stated that Jobs had the flu and was on antibiotics. Jobs continued to maintain that his health was a private issue and would not discuss it. Shareholders and others stated that since Jobs had such a hands-on approach to running the company, that he should be more forthcoming with information regarding his health. Later, the New York Times reported that in an off-the-record phone conversation with Jobs, he did have something more significant than the flu, but that it was not life-threatening and that he did not have cancer. In spite of his reticence in talking about his health, early in 2009, reports of weight loss had begun to circulate, and there were concerns that his cancer had returned. Jobs countered by stating that he was dealing with a hormone imbalance and had a liver transplant. He spent nearly a year out of the public eye to come out to give a keynote address at the Apple event September 9, 2009.
I'd like to take a moment and thank everybody in the Apple community for the heartfelt support I got, too. It really meant a lot. And I'd also like to especially thank Tim Cook and the entire executive team of Apple. They really rose to the occasion and ran the company very ably in that difficult period. So thank you guys. Let's give them a round of applause.
Jobs was on medical leave for most of 2011 and ended up resigning as CEO of Apple in August of that same year. He had even been elected chairman of the board and remained in that position. After this announcement, shares in Apple stock dropped 5% in after-hours trading, while shares in Disney dropped 1.5%. On October 5, 2011, Apple Incorporated announced that co-founder Steve Jobs had died. He was 56 years old at the time of his death. His death was caused by respiratory arrest related to his metastatic tumor. His contributions to technological advancement continue to earn Jobs honors and public recognition even after his death.
The near-term future won't experience much of any bumps in the road, if you will. But the question is, what's next for Apple down the line, 10 years from now? Will they continue to innovate? Will they be able to have the major hype that's associated with their product launches? And that's a question obviously yet to be answered.
I think that with Steve Jobs passing away, that Apple loses, obviously, a certain kind of leadership that it just can't replicate. Steve Jobs was, in many ways, a genius. And genius is not obtained by study. It's not obtained by practice. Mozart was a genius. No one taught him how to write a symphony. He just did it. And so we lost that.
In her eulogy to her brother at his memorial service, Mona Simpson stated, "I grew up as an only child with a single mother. Because we were poor and because I knew my father had emigrated from Syria, I imagined he looked like Omar Sharif. I had hoped he would be rich and kind and would come into our lives and our not yet furnished apartment and help us. Later, after I had met my father, I tried to believe he'd changed his number and left no forwarding address because he was an idealistic revolutionary, plotting a new world for the Arab people. Even as a feminist, my whole life I'd been waiting for a man to love, who could love me. For decades, I thought that man would be my father. When I was 25, I met that man, and he was my brother."
Can Apple continue its success? My own judgment is, to some extent. I think the next 3 years are going to be very good for Apple. I think long term, the idea that companies succeed and grow and are the most successful company in the world forever is an illusion. It never works that way. There are bumps on the road, new opportunities open, new threats open, and the world changes. And so this particular formula that Steve Jobs has used to propel this company, it runs out of steam at some point.
If they've learned anything from Steve Jobs' influence and impact and his relentless pursuit of excellence when it came to Apple products, then they should be fine.